Hello, good morning, and welcome back to Jack's Coffee Break. My name is Jack, this is my coffee break. Today we are continuing our build series. So we have talked about a whole bunch of stuff at this point. We've talked about everything from the widget to spicing up different buildings to making buildings that house multiple different functions. And today I want to start talking about habitats. And unfortunately, the problem with this is that this is an enormous subject. And there are lots of different philosophies about it, different ways that people like to build their habitats, different need to haves, preferences, styles. It's an absolutely just massive subject to really talk about. However, I want to try and start with some basics, just some straight up basic stuff. So to that end, we are going to talk about what makes a Planet Zoo habitat function, what designates it as a habitat, and what does the game think that you need in order to meet the needs and requirements of your animals. So I have here sort of your basic setup for like a franchise zoo. There are some things that I've done differently. For example, I don't recommend getting a quarantine when you first open your zoo. It's often kind of pointless. You're not going to have enough animals that your veterinarian doesn't realize that you have injured animals, you know? You're not going to have so many animals coming into your zoo that your veterinarian is going to be swamped with work and not be able to get to the sick animals quickly enough. So even if you just buy 2 animals, drop them in a habitat, and the veterinarian immediately runs in and grabs them, takes them over to the vet, in many ways that's actually faster than trying to deal with the quarantine. And of course there are some other issues. Within the last couple of patches we've had an issue, at least on my game, yours might be different, it might be a save file issue for me, where I will bring animals into the quarantine and it will immediately check them as ready to go back to the habitat, and it's not until a good 30 seconds has elapsed that it will detect that any issues are actually going on. The quarantine used to function as expected before. I don't know what happened. So I have your standard, your staffed rest area, your trade center, your keeper hut. Quarantine, again, completely optional. I don't recommend it at the start. I recommend it when you get more animals into the game. And your veterinary clinic, which is mandatory. I also have your vet, your keeper, and your caretaker. Real quick, I do want to cover something. We will talk about staff more in depth, but these are really the 3 I recommend starting off with, and you can actually even exclude the caretaker for the first 20 minutes of the game or so. The veterinarian and the caretakers are the ones who actually run the animals to the habitat, so you need one or the other. Of course, the veterinarian cares for the animals while the caretaker cleans the bins. And then you need a keeper in order to make sure that the animals are properly fed. So I actually recommend that you don't get a caretaker until you're 20-30 minutes into the game, you've actually got some income coming in, wait on that. Get the veterinarian first because they're actually needed. But that's for, elaborating on that is for a different tutorial. So let's talk about what we actually have in here. This is the most basic setup you can possibly have for your animals. There's not even enrichment. What we have are 2 African wild dogs. These are some of my favorite animals in the entire game. Not in real life, but in this game, for whatever reason, they just, I don't know, I really like keeping them. So I've got 2 of these, and an accidental Aldabra giant tortoise. I didn't mean to buy it. I thought that I was getting a second female for the African wild dogs, and then this showed up and I was like, we'll see how long it lives. But so far they haven't been messing with it, so it makes me wonder if you can actually keep these animals in the same habitat. Interestingly, their terrain requirements, they're tight, but you can make it work, shockingly. So we also have the terrain painted. I have a mixture of long grass, short grass, dirt, and sand in here, and I've done absolutely no detailing with it. I've just met their bare minimum requirements. And I have this prefabricated shelter. This comes with the base game. I have sunk it into the ground. Normally there's a foundation underneath here, but I like to sink that into the ground just so that way you don't see it. We have their food. We have the food tray for the dogs, and we have the food tray for the tortoise. This is technically all you need. Just this barrier and these bare items, and this will get your welfare up into the green. It's not great, you clearly need some enrichment, but when you're first starting off in franchise or challenge mode, this is what your setup is probably going to look like, of course with different animals. So this is all the game asks of you. This is really it. We also have some viewing windows for your guests to actually see into the habitat. And of course, if I were trying to go all the way with this, I would have an education board right here, I'd have a donation bin, and maybe I'd have some bins and benches to make sure that the guests don't get, you know, bored or tired or throw their garbage all over the road. But this is it, you know. Technically, you need to do nothing else. And of course, as players, we're not satisfied with that. You know, that's not a good enough answer. Nobody wants to see, you know, these awesome animals kept in a square space with, you know, really flimsy walls and just the most bare minimum viewing area. This is not optimal per what we expect. But one of the things that I have heard from new players is that it's often very difficult to break out of this, to start thinking in organic shapes and to get creative ideas. To that end, if it's not already up on the channel, it will be shortly. We have a video coming out of different templates of habitats that you might consider using. You know, different general shapes, different ways to set up a habitat for viewing, tiers, adding water, those sorts of things. So look for that. That will not be what this video covers. What I want to talk about instead is how we can start branching away from this. So I think the first thing a lot of people are going to do is we're going to go into barriers. And right now I have angle snap on because it's easy enough for me to just make a square like this. The way that I recommend starting to branch off, especially if you don't know what kind of shape you want, is to zoom in, put down a fence, make sure that angle snap is turned off, and just start going. I think I want it to go this direction, and then I want it to go this direction. And now let's find our... There. Okay. So by zooming in and just sort of clicking, I've ended up with this. Just sort of clicking wherever feels right in my gut. Just going for it. No thoughts, head empty. This feels like a good place to turn. I think I want to go this direction. Just going for it. And we've already got this rather funky looking shape, and completely by accident. Again, no planning happened here. This was the absolute antithesis of planning. But when you take angle snap off, it removes your control to be precise. And when you're creating organic shapes, that's exactly what you want. You don't want preciseness in an organic shape. An organic meaning a shape that is not limited by lines and angles. You know, it's defined more by circles and curves and depth and height variation. It no longer looks like something that a human put on paper. It looks like you just sort of closed your eyes and tried your best. And so by simply taking off angle snap, zooming in, and sort of going where your gut feels like you should go, and then trying to make it all match up by the end, you can get some really interesting shapes, you know, like this one. So let's go ahead and decide that this is going to be the new habitat for our dogs and tortoise. So how are we going to interpret this shape? So the first thing is that this area right here, this big square, to me, this feels like a really great place to put a shelter. You know, it's sort of in this off section. It doesn't really feel like if you... Let me put it another way. If this isn't an area for your animals to hide and have space in, the other thing that we're looking at, and let me just go ahead and select this entire barrier. Let me put some windows in it. Here we go, glass windows. And I'm going to go to explore mode. Here we go. So when we're down here and we're looking at sort of the guest viewing area, this is that same square that we were looking at from above. If we stand right here along this wall, we have this massive area, and by about this point on the mid-range, anything farther back than that and your guests are going to complain that they don't have a very good view of the animal. And they're right, because your animal's going to be tiny by the time that it gets over there. So let's go to this side then of this square. This gives us a nice short area, but because it sort of sets itself inward, once we come to about right here, this massive space over here is completely blocked off from our view. Let's say that we go to the opposite end, right? So if we come over here, we have this incredibly long walkway. This is a very big space. And while, yes, your guests can walk through the entire area, if we decide that this is going to be a viewable space, that sort of leaves this as your quiet space. It's very small, and especially if you have stressed or shy animals are going to be listed in the Zoopedia. They will be species data. They'll be listed here, relation with humans. Now, our dogs are confident, and so is our tortoise. He does not care whatsoever about humans. But even so, they still need some space that's sort of private away. And with the amount of space that these dogs need, this section right here really doesn't cut it. On top of that, this massive stretch through here feels like something where we could be putting buildings, we could be putting guest facilities, we could be putting staff facilities. So to my eye, this is the perfect private space. And just to show that off, I'm going to go ahead and take a sand coarse, and I'm going to paint this area with that. It's not going to stay permanent, I'm just doing this to show you my train of thought. So we're going to say that this is their private area. Next, we need to think about where a good space for our guests to view into the habitat is actually going to be. So we've eliminated this whole stretch through here. But I think that this little inlet right here might actually be really cool. So maybe we leave this window just so that way you have a little bit of a view, and then the rest of this is locked off. But we may decide against it. We may block this off. If we have our guests look through this section through here, we have an enormous amount of area. So the guests are going to be able to see from here to here, and it's still close enough that your guests are still going to be able to get a fairly good view of the animals. And that sort of leaves this little wonky section right here. And under normal circumstances, I would call this dead space. So aside from being a popular sci-fi franchise, what is dead space? What does that term mean? So dead space, in terms of decorating and architecture and building, means an area that has no purposeful or visible use. Think about it this way. When you walk into your room, where is your laundry pile? That's probably your room's dead space. And the reason why we would use that as a laundry pile or a storage heap or whatever is because there's no utility that we can pull out of that space under its current configuration and under our current usage requirements. And this right here, this says to me that it's going to be dead space. The reason I say that is because when we go into our habitat, we go into enrichment, say for our giant tortoise, we look at the items available. So we have blocks of frozen fruit, we have fruit spike trees, we have balls, all of these different things. If we put them right here, yes, the animal might come up here and play with them, but then they're going to bounce away and they're going to revert back into this general area where they actually have more room to use those things. If we add in our wild dog items, we have this piñata. Now this might be cool, this might be an easy way for our guests to see our dogs quote-unquote hunting. However, no matter what, if we put something here, it's not going to feel like the animals are going to come through here very often. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. It could be good private space, but we're already going to allocate this, so it doesn't make sense. So rather than assuming that we need to force a usage out of this, we have really two options. The first one is that we just shave this off. We just take our border tool and we just cut straight through and we remove this little indent. But I like having this little niche in here. It lets our guests feel like they're sort of in the habitat without actually being in the habitat. It's very cool. On top of that, we know that the dogs are going to require a lot of space. They're going to need to be able to roam around this entire section. I think that this is a good place for us to think vertically rather than just in terms of flat. So this is another place where it can be a little bit difficult to break out of the box, right? Is where do we add verticality? Where do we go up and down? And this is one of those places where I think that we might get better use out of. So let's go ahead and iron out some things that we know that we want. First things first, I know that I want this space in here to be guest viewing. So I'm gonna go ahead and start allocating it as such. There we go. Maybe we have something like that. And then maybe we have paths that go this way and this way. And I seem to have made a Goomba. Next, let's talk about this area. So again, verticality I think is going to be our best friend. So let's go ahead and say that in here, I want a raised viewing platform. Now this is, what I'm doing right here has the potential to get you into trouble, but I'm gonna show you some things that you can do to avoid that trouble. First things first, we're going to make sure that it's raised well and above our 2-meter limit. This is so that way the animals can't accidentally jump onto the platform. I've had that happen before. I'm going to say that this is going to go like this, and I'm actually going to turn angle snap back on for just a moment. So I'm going to keep it off, decide which direction I want it to go. Angle snap back on. There we go. I'm going to pull it up this way. I'm going to turn here. And I'm going to come straight down where it will let me connect, right there. I'm going to pull this up, and now I'm going to connect it again, and I've made this little circle platform. By having angle snap on, I can snap to this center if I'm careful. I'm going to pull it out this direction, and now I'm going to start making my not my sidewalks. I'm going to start making my slopes. So this is where I said that you can start to get into trouble. Look at this. When we try to connect it to the ground, we end up with this awkward little slope. So this is where we come into our pathing. So I am going to come into this little gear tab on my pathing. I'm going to come all the way to the bottom, and I'm going to click this elevated length. And it's going to highlight at 4 meters. This is the default. I'm actually going to bring this all the way down to the smallest it will go. And now it's going to let me choose to create these little tiny sections here. So I'm going to create this one little spot right here where it's got a bit of a ramp, and now I'm back on the ground. There we go. So the next thing I can decide is whether or not 4 meters is going to be the right amount of space for this area through here. I do like the idea of having a little garden, but I do think also that we can have our paths be just a little bit larger. So I'm going to remove these, and I'm going to see what I can do with a 5-meter path. It's a little bit more awkward, but this isn't terrible. Of course, another way that we can do this is to start over here, bring it across, not let it connect with that. There we go. And so now we still have this little tiny green area, and we can decorate that as much as we like. Perhaps we'll put our education board there. And of course we do have these curves, and we're going to do something with that in a little bit, but not yet. So now we have essentially 2 viewing areas. So let's go check what those are going to look like. Let's go into explore mode. I'm having to crouch down on the ground because these are just a little bit too short. So now we're going to have this viewing area right here. We now have this viewing area right through here. Now this is going to do a couple of things. In theory, this is going to remove this from being a private area. But we're actually going to put some sort of building or coverage or something here so that way the animals have hard shelter. And so this will remain private even with people being able to see the building. It also gives us the full area of this space, and it gives our animals even more hard shelter. Now again, we can make some choices. We can decide that we're going to cut across this and remove that from our space, or we can decide to keep this as is. So already we've made some vast improvements, and I think the next thing that we need to do is we need to go ahead and move these animals into here. To that end, we need to decide where our habitat gate is going to go. Now since this is going to be their shelter area, I believe that I'm going to add my habitat gate over here, and we can always adjust later. Alrighty, our dogs have been moved in and our turtle is on the way. So the first thing we need to do is we need to make sure that we check their requirements. Their welfare is not doing great. We see that their terrain needs are not being met. Of course, their nutrition is also sort of questionable. So we see that they need quite a bit of adjustment here. But we also see that their hard shelter is completely met. But why? We haven't added any hard shelter in, have we? But that's the thing. We have. This counts as hard shelter. In fact, anything that blocks the animal's view of the sun is a large, consistent object, as in there's no holes in it, and is considered as opaque by the game. That means that you can't see through it. Anything in the game found under the construction tab that is a flat beam, or alternatively a path, or even a hole in the ground, can actually count as hard shelter. Hard shelter just means that there's something above them that is going to block their view of that's going to block their view of the sky, and that rain is not going to be able to hit them through. So you could theoretically make a hard shelter by just digging a hole. For example, if we went into terrain, sculpting, let's make this a little smaller. Let's make this a 4. Flattened a foundation, made this smaller again, covered up this hole a little bit, smoothed this out. There we go. So long as our animals can navigate into this space, we see that this now counts as a kind of hard shelter. The animals can go into this under area, and they're able to use it as though it were an actual cave. Now I don't want to do that for this example, so I'm going to go ahead and flatten this out and remove it. There we go. And now one of the important things to note about this game is that there's no such thing as too much hard shelter. There is such a thing as too little, and that is something that you need to watch out for. But it is impossible to offer your animals too much hard shelter. And that is a tool that we will use in further examples once we get into more complicated kinds of habitats. For now, though, I think that I'm happy with this. We have an upstairs viewing area, we have a downstairs viewing area. Next, let's go ahead and get some kind of building in here. For the sake of simplicity, again, to keep this as sort of a builder-friendly to keep this more beginner-friendly, let's go ahead and see what kind of pre-built shelters we can use. Now, I think this African shelter is a little bit too big, but this one is probably good. So we can use something like this. Alternatively, we could use this sort of large classic shelter. And one of the things that you'll note on all of these is that in some way they are open air. There's a way for air to pass through them. Does this actually matter in the game? No, it doesn't. Even though a lot of shelters have open air space, it's perfectly acceptable to make this an enclosed building. I'm going to keep this as is because this is not a build tutorial, this is a habitat tutorial, and I want to keep it as such. But this is a perfectly acceptable, sort of safe area for them to come hide in. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my barriers, and I'm actually going to remove guest viewing areas. I don't want my guests to be able to see this entire section. So I'm going to remove the glass. Next, I also don't want my guests to be able to see through here either. This leaves me with this stretch of area that we haven't looked at yet. This whole curve through here. This whole long viewing area does a couple of things to the arrangement of the habitat. So we already designated this as sort of their safe area, and we designated this as a secondary safe area. However, by being able to view along these angles, yes, we get absolute maximum view of the animals at all times, which is great for us, and it's great for our guests, but it's not good for the health of the animals. And there's a secondary fact to this that we need to consider. When your guests approach the animals, they're only going to be able to see what you let them see. Now this has its ups and its downs. For example, if you have an approach that is maybe just a little bit higher up. Let's say that the section of the zoo that you're building this in is just below this cliff. Well now, if you have a path up here, your guests are going to be able to view into the habitat just as well as they could on this platform. If your guests are able to perceive the animals, then this may result in them checking an internal box that says, yes, I viewed this animal. And depending on the quality of that view, i.e. how close the animal was to the guest when they checked that box, you will get 3 different returns. The first is, I can barely see this animal. The second is, the view from here is fine, I guess. And the third is, I will cherish this forever. I'm not being hyperbolic, those are actually what they say. Essentially red, yellow, and green. Up here, I would rate this probably as being a red view. Yes, your guests are going to be able to see that animal. It's going to check their internal box that says, I said this animal. They may offer a donation, but they're going to complain, and they're going to say that their view of the animal was not good. Meanwhile, the view from this little inlet is going to range from yellow to green. If they're in the far corner like they are right now, they're probably going to rate it as a yellow. If the animal is any closer, they're probably going to rate it as a green. So, this is where we need to manage our guest and our animal behavior. First things first, since we have the freedom to choose not to do this particular setup for our zoo, let's go ahead and remove this bluff. We don't need it. Next, I'm going to say that this entire section through here should not be viewable. By choosing to make this an unviewable space, we've pushed our guests to use these 2 viewing areas regardless of what paths we may have surrounding this habitat. The second thing we've done is we've given ourselves a lot of freedom, and this is also important, because now we can use this abutting barrier to designate more habitats and make this a habitat grouping through here. We could choose, for example, to have a little food court over here with an animal that a guest would view here, and an animal that the guest would view over here, say that we were to remodel this habitat. The lack of a view to the African wild dogs is going to push the guests to focus on the animal over here, and the animal over here, and the guest areas. And they're not going to collect in this space for this animal. This is a very good way to regulate appeal and crowding. If this is a very high appeal animal, and this is a very high appeal animal, then any path you have through here is going to become highly congested. If this is a high appeal animal, and this is a high appeal animal, and you have a guest facility through here, then this guest facility area is also going to be extremely crowded because the guests essentially are tackling 3 different topics at once. They're viewing animal A, animal B, and dealing with their needs. This can create congestion. If we have an animal viewing through here, and then the guests come through here into our guest needs area with a low appeal animal through here, then we have reasons to pull the guests through this space, but at no point does it ever risk becoming too congested, at which point we can pull them in other directions of our zoo. It also leaves this entire area free. For example, if we wanted to take our staff buildings over here, and we wanted to move them closer for ease of access, this would be the perfect wall to do that with. So by not allowing your guests to view certain areas of your habitat, you can actually offer yourself more freedom than if you were to make the entire area viewable. Right now, I think that this is acceptable. So let's go ahead and meet our animals' very basic needs. First off, we need to go ahead and get their food, their water, and their enrichment in, because we've already tackled their shelter. Personally, if I'm not going to add water to a habitat, I like to use this particular water pipe. The reason why is because when you use the water trough large and the water trough small, it requires your keeper to come in and periodically refill the animal's water. This water pipe never requires refilling, and so it removes one more thing that your keepers need to do and reduces the amount of workload that they have. I want to make sure that my animal needs are being met, but I don't want these need items to be seen by guests. So I'm going to put a water pipe here. I'm going to put the food tray for the dogs over here. And I'm going to put the food tray for the turtles over here. This leaves me with plenty of area for bedding. Bedding is not necessary in your habitat. Instead, what it does is it designates to the animal, hey, I want you to rest here. This is the most comfortable space for you. And so it inclines the animal to become more likely to actually use their shelters. Otherwise, your dogs have a 50-50 chance of choosing to rest here or to rest over here. By not putting bedding over here, we encourage them to rest in the bedding over here. This can be useful if you make dens that have guest viewing areas. It encourages the animal to actually use the den and for your guests to be able to get a good view into that space. Lastly, let's go ahead and deal with our enrichment. Because we've accidentally made a mixed species habitat, assuming that our turtle ever actually came in. I'm not sure that it did. It did. Where are you? There you are. You're a little stuck. Let me go ahead and move you. There he goes. So when you make a mixed species habitat, one of the interesting things that you can do is to make sure that the enrichment that you're using, when applicable, actually mixes between both species. In this case, some of the enrichment toy items for both the dogs and the tortoise are the same, so I've used those. There we go. The yard has been created. The next thing, of course, that we need to do is we need to manage our terrain. There's just a little bit too much sand for our dogs. And that's okay because we're going to reduce this anyway. So let's go ahead and deal with our short grass. We're going to need quite a bit for both of these animals. And now let's meet their soil needs. Let's double check with our Aldabra. Is this acceptable? It is. So now we've met the needs of both of these animals. We have perfect amounts of space, hard shelter, and terrain. And we have all of their enrichment needs met. The only thing that they're lacking on is nutrition, which of course we can change by going into the habitat barrier, clicking over to animals, and changing this food quality. It's very important that if you're playing on challenge or franchise mode, that you don't immediately bump these up because the animals can end up eating you out of house and home. Only do this when you have a comfortable amount of income coming in and you feel that it's appropriate to start upgrading their food. While it does increase their welfare, it does very little else, and your animals will be satisfied in their needs whether they're on grade 1 or grade 3. I happen to be on sandbox, so it's not going to affect me one way or the other. Here we go. And now on their next feeding, the animals, of course, are going to get that full 100% boost, and their welfare is going to be perfect. Again, this habitat is not necessarily much better than this habitat, but what we've done is we've made ourselves some bones that we can use in order to adapt this and create something a little bit better. Rather than having a box shape, we now have this organic shape. Rather than having a single small flat area to view the animals from, we have multiple angles to enjoy the animals from. Instead of having the singular flat open shelter, we now have a more dynamic shelter space. So from here, this is really where you can start to let ideas sort of come into your mind and decide where you want to go with them. I have no idea what this white beam is. It appears to be some kind of technical glitch. So for example, one of the next things that you could decide to do is rather than having this dedicated barrier, you could begin to replace it with construction pieces. This is going to remove the need for a mechanic to come through and fix your barrier. A simple way to do this is to go in, select your barrier, select the entire thing, and click null. The point of the null barrier is to let the game know that, hey, this space is dedicated for this particular animal, treat it as though a barrier is here, but because the barrier is invisible, your animals can pass through it unless you have a specific sandbox setting turned on. Your guests can pass through it without any issues, and your guests can see through it. So the way that you prevent your animals from being able to escape is by going through and creating your own custom barriers. And this is where a lot of creativity can happen. You could choose, for example, to go into nature and create a rock barrier. So long as it keeps your animals in, it qualifies. Alternatively, you could do the same with construction pieces. We will do an entire tutorial just talking about the different ways that you can utilize barriers and change them up in order to create more dynamic habitats and zoos. However, for now, I think we've sort of covered the very basics on starting to adapt your habitats away from the standard box and move towards these more organic shapes. Thank you for joining me. Next episode, we will be taking this basic habitat and we will be improving it and sort of building upon some of the ideas that we've had in this episode to make it a more unique space. Hopefully this has been useful to you. If there is anything that you would like to see me do a tutorial on that we haven't done already, please drop me a comment and I'll be happy to do so. Have a great day and happy building.